Hello, this is Pick, and welcome back to my guide for FTB Sky's Expert Mode. The first thing on my mind today is Computercraft. It was recently added in the 1.5.0 update. While I'm not some wizard who can use these things extensively to their fullest, I can certainly use it for some small projects here and there. Primarily, I'll be using a feature called Turtles. Turtles are effectively computers that can run programs that interact with the world. What a given turtle is capable of doing is dependent on the tool it has. It does use some basic programming in order to function, but I'll tell you the basics of what you need to know in order to make something like what I've made. Here I have a basic Livingrock automation set up. Bees are making infested stone for me, and that gets sent into this hopper on top of the turtle. I have a display case from Ars Nouveau reading the contents of the turtle. In particular, I'm looking for infested stone, which is the ingredient for Livingrock. I can only run this code when there's Livingrock present, as that's what the wait timer is dependent on. You could use other factors to redstone control it to only go when Livingrock is present, but I think it's easier to just make the wait timer personally. I should also mention that that hopper is being disabled by the display case if the infested stone count is greater than the threshold I want it to be, with some buffer time added in, so it's set to 14 even though I want it to be set to 16. Once I type in the program name in the turtle, which is Livingrock, the turtle will go about and do his business. I added in some print code for debugging purposes. That just helps me see what step it's on when I was trying to get it to work in the first place. To get started making a program, type in edit and then your program name. Again, mine is Livingrock. I then have the turtle select the first slot within its inventory. This makes sure that it's always going to use blocks in that first slot. Following this, I have a while loop. Basically, a while loop is what you use when you want to have it keep running until a certain criteria is not met. For me, I'm going to have it run unless it's out of infested stone. I then make that debug print code I was talking about, and that's basically confirmation that it made it to that step. From here, this is just a bunch of brute force micro steps that get it to do what it needs to do. Computercraft's wiki from way back in the day is still relevant now, so don't be afraid to use that as a resource, it's very useful. You also need to fuel your turtle. Simply put in some fuel, and before you run any code, type turtle.refuel or something like that. Again, check the wiki. As long as the turtle has fuel, it will be able to move. So, when it goes for turtle.forward, that means that it's going to move forward one block. Dig down means that the mining turtle I have is going to dig the block below it. Then it's going to place down from slot 1, which is the slot with the infested stone in it. It then repeats this process for the second block and for the third, but after the third it's going to turn right. Then it will move forward again, and then it will move forward again, and then it will turn right again. And it will continue this until it gets back to that first piece of Livingrock, which is then broken and turned into infested stone again. I then have the turtle turn right one last time before it backs into the spot where the drawer and hopper are. The hopper refeeds the drawer with infested stone, as I said, and then the pulling drawer on the bottom is taking out the Livingrock that's in its inventory. Once you understand all the parts and pieces, Computercraft isn't that hard to learn. You don't have to do any of these hyper fancy things that people can do with it. A simple automated task like this is easy to learn and easy to understand, and it allows you to do brute force methods like from what I did. The reason it's in a while loop is so that it keeps running perpetually, and it has an end after the loop to determine that that's the point where the loop would theoretically end. You will have to turn it back on every time you load your world, but that's just how it is with turtles. In this case with Livingrock, you also need to make sure it sleeps for long enough so that the Livingrock can be reprocessed from that infested stone. It also has to keep up with infested stone production, so you might want to set a longer timer. Make sure you save it by holding Control and hitting Enter on save. With Livingrock in large quantities, I can now make the Runic altar from Britannia. This is another compact crafting setup, so of course you'll have to build that and chuck in a mana diamond to get it started. You'll want to make sure you place it next to a mana pool, as the mana spreader is going to have to fire mana into the Runic altar for it to craft. Before we can get to making Britannia runes though, we need to make Elementalcraft runes first. This starts with the gem crystallizer. This uses an amount of elemental essence and some different types of crystals in order to produce these gems. The output of the recipe is random. It's weighted mostly getting crude gems, of course, and the flawless gems are a lot harder to get. but you can use different recipes to get higher tier gems with higher frequency. For now, I get enough from the lower tier crafts though, so that's all I'm going to do. It just requires a diamond and a crystal per. I will be getting to a fair amount of Elementalcraft stuff later in the episode, so stay tuned for that if you're interested. I can't stress enough the importance of having multiple elemental containers. Not only do you have more stockpiled ready to go, but you also have the ability to do different types of crafts at the same time. I'm currently making a rune inscriber, and this allows the Elementalcraft runes to be made. They alter the properties of Elementalcraft things, such as making it faster or transfer faster or use less element. That being said, I think all the recipes in this have been made pretty fair at this point compared to base Elementalcraft, so runes aren't 100% necessary, though still nice to have. To make a rune, simply place all of the ingredients on in the correct order, then place the blank rune on it, and once it's done infusing, right-click with the inscription tool. Thankfully, they're not all too expensive, especially once we get to Autocrafting. Then, once you have all the ingredients for your Britannia runes, drop them onto the Runic altar, right-click with the Livingrock, and then right-click with the Wand of the Forest. Once it has enough mana, it'll finish. Now that I have runes, I can make a Rosa Arcana. This is the special Britannia flower that generates mana from experience orbs. I usually have a bunch of experience lying around underneath the witch farm. Now I can actually tap into that. By crafting a generating or functional flower with a floating flower, that's made by making a glowing flower with a mystical flower and 2 glowstone, a pasture seed, and a dirt, you can have a flower that doesn't need a block of dirt under it. Then I can put that underneath the vector plates in the mob farm, and it'll be able to collect the experience orbs through it. Connect that Rosa Arcana to a mana spreader and then to a mana pool. Then I'm going to place a spark on top of each of these mana pools. Sparks are primarily for faster mana transport. You can also augment them to modify the properties of the spark. The most useful ones are Dominant and Recessive. Dominant draws mana towards it, Recessive pushes mana away. I can put a Recessive rune into the mana pool that's connected to the Rosa Arcana's setup to allow it to disperse to 3 other mana pools equally. It will fill the 3 of those up before the Recessive one fills. I think it's about time I upgrade the energy cube again. I'm going to be upgrading power generation today, so I want to make sure that the total flux rate is going to be able to handle it. Eventually I'll just make one big storage battery for bulk stuff, but for the time being I'll just upgrade this single energy cube and call it a day. I set up the Merid Crusher from last episode. Now he's going to automatically process silver. I've set up the smart chute so that exactly half of the silver it sends comes down into the crusher. Then it gets picked up with a filtered item collector, and it gets sent to pedestals which sends it over to the factory building. In addition, I have a redstone link for shut-off, so this is going to let all the silver proceed along the main line as usual if the drawer destination that these are traveling to is filled. I'm going to need a lot of platinum to make the tier 2 rocket, so that's why I'm getting started on it now. I've set up 3 dedicated pyrolyzers for making liquid force. It's still going to take a few hours for this to produce all the liquid force it needs to get enough Iesnium to make the rocket, but for the time being I can just let it sit because there's plenty else to do in the meantime. To get the liquid force in here, I'm simply using pedestals to send things from the pyrolyzers all the way over to the fabrication matrix. You do have another option if you so wish to use it. The Force Infuser is usually used for Forcecraft progression, but here it's not useful for that because there is no Forcecraft progression. However, when you put Force Gems into the Force Infuser, it makes Liquid Force, 500 millibuckets of Liquid Force as opposed to the 200 it takes to craft the Force Gem. This is a net positive loop, and of course you can abuse that if you have mana. I have so many spare Force Slogs though that I'm just not going to do that. It's probably much faster though. Mechanism machines are only so fast, and usually you're crafting stacks upon stacks of given items at a time. While you could make some speed upgrades, I think it's more efficient to use factory upgrades for the early stages. This basically just means you have 3 in 1 now. It's like having 3 machines. You could use this to process 3 stacks of the same item, or 3 different stacks of items if you so wish. By turning on the auto sort feature, you can have it automatically distribute between the 3 inputs. It will always fill the leftmost one first. Typically, this also comes with increasing the total capacity of the machine. For example, the Metallurgic Infuser will hold more of the infusion material in it. The next thing on the list is to make the Quantum Assembler multi-block. This is going to be extremely useful for making different types of fabricated materials. It simplifies some recipes and doubles the outputs of others, as well as having some new ones of course. It's rather pricey though. You're going to need a lot of Fluix crystals. How do you get Fluix crystals? The Dissolution Chamber. This means I'm going to need to make a whole lot of charged Certus and you know that stuff. Crafting in the Dissolution Chamber is slow, tedious, and painful. Thankfully, there's a way to make it less so. I've mentioned before that you could lock slots depending on what recipe you wanted to make, but you can also have it automatically import or export. Simply make sure that it's pulling and pushing from the inventories that you want it to use. Because the crafting slots are locked, it won't have to worry about items going where you don't want them to, and of course you'll need a tank to import fluids from. When crafting the Fluix stairs for the Quantum Assembler, be sure to craft them in the stone cutter rather than the crafting table. This will save you a few blocks of Fluix quartz. Another component for this is Entangled blocks. I haven't quite used Entangled blocks yet, but because the structure of this multi-block has them, it also supports using them. What's useful about them is it allows you to remotely access the sides of a block in case there are too many occupied sides. In this case, with this multi-block, because there's only one exposed face, it might be a little annoying to get everything you need into the center. You can use this to your advantage by having those entangled blocks put the items and or fluids and or power into the machine. If you make a block entangling tool and shift right click on the block you want to link to, you can then right click on an entangled block and it will link the two together. It will render the block that you're trying to link to inside the entangled block. This has a very large number of applications, more than you might expect. It also helps keep things neat inside your base. The machine frames from Industrial Foregoing have double output when processed in this machine. Like I said, there are many useful recipes within this thing. You don't even have to use the entangled blocks for this machine in particular. If you want to use them for some other machine, go right ahead. With these extra yields though, I can make an ore laser. This is similar to the fluid laser, except its specifics are a little different. The ore laser will only work on the correct planet you're trying to mine from. This means you can only get Desh and Cheese from the moon, for example. It can store several different lenses, though obviously if it's only gonna find one ore, it's only gonna mine one ore. I have more than enough Desh, so I'm probably just going to run it on yellow for cheese. Make sure you set it to the proper mining depth, of course. It's not a ton of cheese, but it'll be enough to help us finish off the rocket. I'm going to need 624 of the individual Desh base plating items. That's for 156 Desh base plating blocks, as well as whatever extras I'm going to need. I'd balance it around making 10 stacks of the item. You can make the molten cheese in the magma crucible. What, you've never welded a rocket together out of fondue before? And I'll just be processing a stack of this at a time over the next while until I finish the rocket. It's also worth noting that the Quantum Assembler has a bunch of separate inventories for different fluids. This is so that you can autocraft a little easier if you have extra of a particular fluid. Make sure you check which fluids share the same slot. Once again, the actual crafting is done with this neat little loop setup. Quicksilver is fairly cheap to make. Remember, it's just mineral resin and cinnabar. Of course, you have to filter the desired output product of Desh base plating into the drawer. I'm sure the last thing you want to do right now is craft those other rocket parts on top of this one. Well, thankfully we can put our old rocket through the arc furnace, as we can teleport to both orbit and the moon at this point. This will give us a stack of space plating blocks, which is enough to remake the nose cone and fins. Hooray for recycling materials. Before I head off to Mars though, I think I'm gonna do some village looting on the moon. This lets me get access to those affixed spacesuits I mentioned a while back. It's only a slight buff from what I currently have, but anything is better than nothing, right? Always good to have a spare spacesuit too. Alright, time to head off to Mars. You should pretty much bring equal to or better than the stuff you brought to the moon, as well as a spare teleporter since you want to get back here easily. Once again, I will remind you that you need to load the chunk that you put the teleporter in or you won't be able to reach it. There isn't nearly as much loot on Mars as there is on the moon, at least not in this version. There are supposed to be custom dungeons and bosses in these dimensions, but they're not fully implemented yet. I'll probably make a separate guide video when they're finally ready. The main ore to find here is Ostrum. It's like a purplish, dark colored ore. You could make an Aura Tools builder and quarry card to mine out your Ostrum if you'd like, or just right away set up the ore laser, but I'm just gonna do some mining manually. Just, you know, I want that initial amount. And also remember, you can't get ore blocks by using the laser drill. The Builder Quarry does have a silky option though, so if you want to harvest those ore blocks, that is something you could do. There's not much out there on Mars in terms of structures, so there's not really much to explore. There are a couple, but they're not that big, at least the ones I found. There could be one I just didn't find. Again, I'll cover structures when we actually have them fully implemented into the game. Grab your Ostrom, go home, blah blah blah. I think it's time to upgrade my spellbook again. To do this, I'm going to need to summon and defeat the Wilden Chimera. He shouldn't be too tough with my arm. You might not want to summon him near a bunch of blocks. I do remember hearing that somebody destroyed a compact machine with one of these things. It's not a tough fight at all, but yeah, you might want to make sure the space is clear so all of your stuff doesn't get sent onto the ground. Well, with the Wilden Tribute you get from defeating the Chimera, and the Totem of Undying that you can get from Lunarian clerics on the moon by trading them Lumium coins, you can make the Archmage Spellbook. This allows you to use all glyphs up to tier 3, which is of course the maximum tier. In particular, I'm looking to make use of that glide rune I had. This way I can get elytra gliding without actually having to wear one. So, if I wanted to, I could glide all the way back to that sky village. Not that there's that much of a reason to, but I'm going to reappropriate all of that white rock. You know, because I'm too lazy to use my turtle that's designed to automatically do this Livingrock stuff and just retrofit it for white rock. Time to make a dedicated Elementalcraft automation setup. Well, not much of it's going to be automated, but the creation of the elements themselves will be automated, and not in the same way I did before with the mob grinder. I can use a refinery to take liquefied source and turn it into different elemental fluids. These can then be processed through the mana crystallizers that were used for force gems, and with some mana and rotational power, I can turn that into elemental shards. To make mana, I'm just sending cake over from the other setup. I know I have that Rosa Arcana going, but I'm going to be using that for automated crafting and Terrasteel and stuff. This is just going to make more use of cakes that I already have. I'm using that Vortex Tube Flux Compressor setup to make the heating go. Remember that you have to make a system that can actually support what you're trying to do. So don't put in more speed upgrades than the flux compressor can handle. It will balance out its pressure by itself, so as long as you're not overpressuring it, don't worry about it exploding on you. Here's a basic setup for using that logistical sorter to automate element production. Same thing you've seen me do with the logistical sorter before. Sends things to colored outputs. Of course I color coded them properly instead of going by just the first 4. It's somewhat modular as well. I do end up adding a second set of elemental evaporators onto the line. By the way, the low output of those fluid blaze burners is a bug. I fixed it and now it'll operate at the correct temperature of around 900 instead of around 128. This means my refinery setups are just that much quicker. Not that I need that high of a refinery rate yet. Now to set up pure crystal crafting. This was ludicrously expensive in the beta versions, but on this one it's been made far cheaper. Note that for this recipe you're going to need at least a tier 2 gem or better. Either roll the dice or use the better recipe, as I previously stated. I'd also recommend having an infuser and a binder for each element ready to go. Put down your pure infuser and then put down each of the pedestals around it. The order doesn't particularly matter, but I'm going to make sure that the shortest pipe distance possible is available for each of them. That means the ones on the sides are going to go to each side, and then the ones at the center are going to go along the center. By having space between them, it means I have to do less disconnecting of pipes. A pipe cover frame will help conceal your pipes. Simply place one on the pipe you're trying to conceal, and then place a block into the frame to make it take the appearance of that block. Put one of each of the elemental crystals on the outer pedestals, and then a diamond on the inside one. This will make a pure crystal. Pure crystals are primarily used in high-end Elementalcraft recipes. They're also used for Firite ingots, which is going to be important for upgrading power generation. Of course I'll want to be mass producing this stuff, so the easiest way to do that for right now is just to put a hopper on it and then have an exporting pipe or something that's filtered so that you only extract the product you want. I mentioned the ordered sorter previously, but here's where I'll be using it now. Place an inventory with a space between it above your elemental binder. You can adjust the sides manually, but it's a pain, so the easiest way to do it is to just place it on the opposite side and it'll automatically orient itself correctly. Then all you have to do is right click on the ordered sorter with each of the items, in order of course, that we want them to be sent in. Place an inventory above the ordered sorter and it'll slowly one by one put every item in order into the elemental binder. It will only send things in once you extract the split alloy, so don't worry about it overstocking. Speaking of quick and dirty automations before applied energistics, I've automated the Energizing Orb. You could use item transporters with stack limiting or laser IO or something to automatically fill the orb, but I'm just going to use vanilla stuff because it's easier. All you have to do is place your hopper underneath the Energizing Orb, a comparator off of it, hook that comparator up to a redstone torch with a block on it so that you invert the signal, and then have some redstone dust going into some droppers. Make sure you're powering the block next to the dropper and not the dropper itself, as we don't want to lock the hopper in the process. This will only send one bout of items through every time the item finishes crafting. You do have to bootstrap it every time with one initial item in the orb, but I think that's pretty easy to take care of anyway. Remember, this isn't going to be permanent, this is just enough so that we can get things started and not have to manually input the items every time. It also works for items no matter how much energy is in it, so you don't have to worry about the timer or changing its length. Ring by ring, I'm going to upgrade my generator magnet coils. I can do this in the arc furnace by doing 12 crafts at once. They only use about 40 RF per tick as opposed to most recipes, so it's pretty easy to just do all 12. However, of course, I still need power to make the things, so I have to leave most of them running for the time being to power the arc furnace in the first place. The craft takes a while, so you're going to be sitting here for a bit. Or at least I will be. Alright, all done. Time to upgrade the last generator coil. This means my total power production from generator coils has doubled. However, this also means that my stress units are just about at the max right now. I can't make any more generator coils because that'll be too much on the system. I'll probably look into an upgrade on that next episode, but for the time being, I think this is good enough. Now then, let's make an ME controller. I'm gonna want a bunch of these things. I'll have 8 by the end of the episode, but to make one, again, compact crafting. Remember that you can get Skystone from the Pure Daisy, or you could have a bee farm it for you. With the Quantum Assembler, getting all of that Fluix isn't much of a challenge. I would definitely wait until after you have the Quantum Assembler to get your controller set up in the first place. Technically, you don't need a controller, you just need an energy acceptor, but then you're limited to 8 channels, and it's not really worth it at that point when you can just wait and get the controller. Now, I don't know about you, but I find the crystallizer to be slow, boring, and tedious. So how do we get around that? Well, we can make flawless budding Certus. It grows much like budding amethyst. To get started though, we're going to have to make the most basic form. Simply dump a charged Certus quartz and a Certus block into water, and then it will upgrade to stage. 3 charged Certus upgrades it to the max tier, which is flawed. You then put that into the enrichment chamber to make it into flawless. And luckily enough, these guys get harvested from the amethyst golem in the same manner. So it's super easy to set up a farm for them. This is a little out of order, but I'm putting this clip first because it's relevant to what we just did. By making some time torches, I can accelerate the growth speed of the Certus quartz crystals. Really easy to make too, just some desh rods and some essences, and since we just made that pure infuser anyway, might as well, right? I believe they work in a 1 radius, so like you have the time torch block, and then anywhere within a cube of 1 distance from the torch is what's accelerated. Except for other time torches, obviously. Back in the present, I'm making magically infused steel the right way this time, with the blocks, so that I don't waste more source and essences than I need. With those in hand, I can make the Terrestrial Agglomeration plate. When building the structure, make sure all of the elemental crystals are in the proper order or it won't work. All you gotta do is remember on top water, then in clockwise you go earth, fire, air. You know, like that one thing about the blue arrow guy. Now to make a base for the Terrestrial Agglomeration plate. This is how it's able to craft things. You simply need to place this structure, it's a checkerboard of Livingrock and lapis lazuli underneath it. You could use a mana spreader to point at this thing and give it mana, but why would you do that? I made that mistake way back in 1.6 or 7. The items despawned. Instead, you can just put a spark on it, and you don't even need any augment. It'll just automatically pull mana in as long as the ingredients are on the plate. It's set to a priority higher than dominant, so it'll draw in all mana around it. You'll then need a bunch of junk that we've mostly already made, The Sentient Steel is just Cognitive Alloy and Terrasteel in the Arc Furnace. The Mana Pylon can be made with the Mana Diamond, Mana Steel Plates, and Gold Ingots. The Eye of Legend is something we've already made from an Eye of Ender and Otherworld Ashes, and Ostrom Dust is just something we got from Ostrom or from Mars. Put all of those into the Element Binder, and that'll craft it into a Natura Pylon. This is required for opening a portal to Alfheim. To set up an Elven Gateway, you're going to need the Elven Gateway Core, some Living Wood, some Glimmering Living Wood, the Natura Pylons, 2 of them, and a mana pool for each of them. You'll also probably want some sparks. Optionally, with the Dominant Spark Augment, be sure to put the spark on before the Natura Pylon. This allows you to have both over the same pool. You might want to put in some mana via a mana tablet to bootstrap the system. In order to fill a mana tablet, you just throw it into a mana pool, and you might have to shift right click with a Wand of the Forest to set it to put mana in items instead of taking it out. Then all you have to do is dump it in the opposite configuration into the mana pools that you want to use for the portal. It'll use a bit of it to start it, and I think it uses some mana every time it crafts, but I'm not sure if it passively decays or not in this version. When you've been around as long as I have, you forget if things like passive drain on the Elven Gateway exist in this version or not. In any case, all you have to do to quote-unquote craft with this is throw items in and items come out. Using some Dragonstone obtained from the Elven Portal and some volatile substrate, I can make Flux Gems. I'll be automating these at some point, but for the time being, I'm just going to make some manually. These are required to make Ostrom processors, which are going to be useful for automation purposes. I went ahead and made a new fluid laser. This one isn't going to be used to get oil or anything though, it's going to be used to get ether gas. This can only be extracted from a wither boss, so you'll want a stasis chamber to make sure the wither doesn't go anywhere. Ideally, you build it so that the arm of the wither is on top of the laser. The drill itself is what does the mining this time. Of course, you'll want to make sure that the drill is exporting into the laser base. Since we're working with the wither, I'd recommend building a witherproof cage around it. Witherproof glass from Cyclic is enough. Or tempered dark glass, I guess. I'd also recommend making an energy cube specifically for the stasis chamber. That way, if anything happens to your power generation, you still have backup power keeping that wither contained. As a rule for troubleshooting, you want to make sure that the wither's center body is in front of the laser drill. It can't be the bottom bit, it's not enough. The goal here is elite circuits. These require that ether gas to craft. What I'm going to make is an upgrade to my QIO. I can finally upgrade to a tier 3 drive. While the item storage capacity is doing more than well for what I have, I am just about out of types, so much so that I needed to make a chest to dump a bunch of single items that I don't need in there. So, about a stack and a half of green circuits later, and I can finally get around to making that upgraded QIO drive. I don't know if I can upgrade QIO drives like you can, say, a Mechanism tank. I guess if Mechanism tanks can do it, I don't see why QIO can't, but let's not take any chances and just make a fresh one. Besides, it will attempt to auto-import when it determines that the system doesn't have proper stock of things in the first place. Alright, with tons of Certus quartz, which means charged Certus quartz and then Fluix quartz of course, I finally finished those 8 ME controllers. You also want to make sure you'll have a fair amount of dense Fluix Smart ME cables of any color variety. And I'm just gonna power this thing with a flux point. I picked a central location to make this thing. I had to move the farm over to fit a building for it. The closer it is to everything, and also the benefit of having it be in a chunk I was already loading, means I don't have to worry about, well, loading it. Normally I just add forced load chunks whenever I run out. There's a command to do that. I think it's /FTB chunks admin add force claim chunks, whatever. If you keep tabbing on FTB chunks, you'll probably find it. Anyway, each of the faces of this ME controller allow 32 channels. Channels are a mechanic that restrict the number of different machines you can have on a given network. In this case, that only applies to applied Energistics things, like pattern providers, or import buses, or storage buses, etc. Each device makes up one channel on your network. You can also get fancy and make the most out of it by using something called P2P tunnels. I don't necessarily need those right now, and I don't know if I'm going to ever need that many channels in this mod pack. We'll see, I guess. I'd rather just automate cables, though, between you and me. The first thing I want to do is hook up some storage buses. This is going to allow us to access alternative inventories using our ME system. Normally, it has a native thing called the ME drive, which stores up to 10 drives in it. I wonder where we've seen something like that before. These drives have a type limit and a total number of items they can store. I wonder where we've seen that before. But because I have this QIO thing, I think I'll be able to hook it up properly. Normally you can't, but thanks to the Applied Mechanistics add-on, there are tons of things you can store in your computer system. However, the drive will be useful for other things that don't necessarily fit into ME systems normally. So, by hooking up one of these QIO dashboards with a ME storage bus, I can access the stuff from the QIO system in the Applied Energistics system. Make sure it's a storage bus and not an interface. I know some of you older Applied Energistics users out there might be confused by some of the newer things that have been happening. Within the Storage Bus GUI, you can alter the priority. It's pretty self-explanatory and it explains everything in the GUI. You'll also need a terminal to access the items from. Of course, I'd opt for a crafting terminal right away. You are restricted by channels for each of your terminals, so be aware of that. You also need to hook it up via cable, unlike the QIO, which just works anywhere. This is why I've left my bulk storage in the QIO and imported all of those ingots and things, so this way I always have access to it. Wireless AE is a ways off. I'm also going to go ahead and hook up all of my drawers with Fluix cables by using those storage buses. I can always connect to an extension instead of the drawer controller itself, that's what they're for. Typically for this stuff you want to use a lot of dense cabling. I haven't automated wool yet, I'll get to that later. I will be upgrading this to a whole bunch of dense cabling to allow more channels through. Typically I'd like restricted storages like drawers that have a higher priority, while things like bulk storage have a lower priority. In my case, most of my drawer stuff is already being pulled in, but that's okay. That stuff I have so much of that I don't know what to do with it all anyway, so wasting a stack here or there in a void drawers, oh well, you know. Let's take a quick peek through the settings on your crafting terminal. The first one is to pin auto-crafted items into the first row. This means if you have auto-crafting operations going, it'll automatically put them at the top for you to take out. Then we have notifying for finishing crafting jobs. I don't have a wireless terminal yet. Automatically clear terminal grid on close. This is useful because I don't want items being stored in the crafting grid and then I wonder where the heck they went. The rest of the stuff is JEI related things. However, I like to turn off Remember Last Search. I also don't really like autofocus. I'll see if I like to have it on or not this time. It's annoying moving between different mods and their crafting systems, you know? The quirks that are slightly different make it so that you don't want to change. I also absolutely hate auto JEI synchronization. Let's get started with auto-crafting. In order to do this, you'll need a pattern encoding terminal and some blank patterns. You can use JEI to shift-click recipes into the pattern provider and then save them onto that pattern. This is the main way of having recipes stored in your ME system. Whenever you unlock auto-crafting, the first thing you're going to want to automate is automation, of course. This comes in the form of the many components that comprise an AE system. I'll also be automating some QIO components. Regular crafting table recipes are done in a machine called the Molecular Assembler. To put patterns onto a given machine, you're also going to need a pattern provider. A few different AE components come in both a panel form and a block form. Each has its use. I think that the block form is a little more useful, but if you want compactness, you can also use the panel form. The block form saves you a cable. Simply put the recipe into the pattern provider and it'll automatically try to craft something in the adjacent inventory. Though make sure you only use one machine per pattern, of course. You'll also need something known as crafting storage if you want to put crafting onto your network. The complexity of a recipe will determine how many bytes it uses. Very simple recipes will be handled by a 1K storage. More complex ones will require a 4K, 16K, or 64K even. You can always craft things in smaller parts if you need to fit them into your crafting storage space. This is why I waited until now to make this system, because you need Austrian processors to make crafting storage. You also can only have one recipe going on any given crafting storage at a time. You can combine them and use things called crafting coprocessors to speed it up. Generally, I'd recommend a mix of variable sizes of things, and I think it will always try to use the smallest available one for a given task. So, we've hooked up normal crafting recipes with the molecular assembler. Now let's hook up a machine. Pretend this entangled block is the machine block it's entangled with. By placing the pattern provider on this specific block, it'll allow it to auto-craft from that specific block. In order to quote-unquote complete a craft, it has to see that the item entered the AE system. Specifically, you can't import to QIO or some other external storage. This can be accomplished using importers, or you can also pipe items back into the pattern provider if it's in block form. Doing that will save you a channel, and remember, that's 2 channels compared to 1, so you're using 50% of the channels you would have used otherwise. You could also opt for a different approach and have one giant condensing inventory that takes all of your machine outputs and imports it through one quick importer. But generally speaking, I think it's easiest to just pipe back into the provider it came from. A handy thing to have around is some storage controllers. These will allow you to pick up any wayward drawers around your base and hook them up into the system by slapping on a storage bus. As long as all of your drawers are locked, you shouldn't have any issues. Now let's talk something a little fancier. The Energizing Orb isn't as easy to automate as some other things. Sure, the recipes are simple, but you can only put in one thing at a time. You can't craft in stacks. This is where the options on the pattern provider come in. The top option you want to make sure you have set to blocking mode. This means it will not send items until it receives what it just sent in. Therefore, items will be allowed to process and then re-enter the system before a new recipe is put in. I did change my design a bit. Originally I thought I could get away with that panel pattern provider, but I decided to go against that in the end. The other option is crafting locking. It's kind of like blocking mode, but it locks the crafting process until a particular criteria is met. For this, you just need blocking mode, don't worry about locking it. I'd recommend having most of your crafters on never lock until we get to a situation where that's probably ideal. The next handy device we have here is the requester. What the requester does is determine based on the number of items in your system if it needs to make a request to craft more. You can set the size in which batches are produced. So, for example, if you wanted to have, say, 64 of a given item in your system, and you set a batch size of 64, if there are 63 items in the system, it will craft another stack, and it won't send another request until it gets underneath 64. I could set up a sheep farm for wool, but I'm feeling kinda lazy, so I'm just gonna use a phytogenic insulator to grow it out of string. I can just use QIO for stuff as well. You know, typical redstone disable stuff, make sure the machine is set to turn off when it receives a redstone signal. This is to supplement the spider farm, which isn't exactly very fast, and it's also not a dedicated spider farm in the first place. I turned loopies back on. This is because they finally implemented the code that allows the loopy loot to upgrade the more of them that spawn. I skipped over a few tiers because I've been having them spawn and, well, you know, they don't really give good loot until I turned them off and just decided it wasn't worth it. But now you can get loot like ultimate tier installers, resonant energy components, Godforged pearls, and some other cool things. This floor is going to be dedicated to single block machines. You know, things like the multi-servo press. Thermal, mechanism, and industrial foregoing can all auto import and export from the same side. This is incredibly useful for sending things back to the requester. It means you can bunch everything up right next to each other without having to think about it. Just make sure you have auto import and auto export enabled and set the side to the blue and orange configuration for thermal. Obviously it varies between mods. You'll probably want a bunch of them for all the various crafting methods there are. Here in particular I'm just dealing with items though, no fluids yet. Pattern providers can connect as long as they're touching, they spread that network connectivity, and I've also decided to automate Metallurgic infusers now. This operates a little differently from the other machines as it has this infuse type it has to deal with. That enters through a different slot. You can actually have infusion types in your ME system, but I don't really see a reason to do that. Instead, I simply have one dedicated infuser for each type of infusion. The requester automatically stocks me with the different types of enriched products for infusion. Then, I'm simply using QIO to save on channels and export all of that infusion stuff into the system. This means I can do all the clean JEI ratios. Ultimately, I made 5, one for each of the main types, plus the source gas. Tin, gold, and mushrooms and biomass just aren't useful enough to warrant having an infuser. That's the thing about AE, you don't need to autocraft absolutely everything, you can keep some things for manual use. Also, it's worth noting that the only thing you can make with carbon is steel. I'm only having it around in case I for some reason need to super mass produce steel instead of what I'm passively making from that one blast furnace. Fluids are their own little mess, but that can be sorted out with another storage bus and a storage controller. For the mechanical squeezer, it only outputs from the bottom. Nothing an Entangled block can't fix though. Why worry about the bottom side being occupied when you can just make a new bottom? It does auto-export fluids any side though it's available. Only items have to come from the bottom. I did automate Memroll and yet another phytogenic insulator. This means I'll have plenty of Memroll to use the fabrication matrix recipe for those circuits. Like I said, focus on your base crafting components first. It gets annoying to micromanage all of that stuff, you know? Plenty of little things to hook up to. I think it's about finally time I completely automated source gems, for example. And I can do all of this using QIO, because I'm just going to do it off of storage capacity. Alright, that should do it for all the metallurgic infusers and stuff. There's plenty more to do, but I think that's enough for now. So, I think that's a good place to stop for today. I'll be continuing with automation in the next episode. Believe me, when you get applied Energistics, you have to spend a lot of time making all these little automations here and there. But having on-demand crafting is always nice, right? Right, of course. So, with that, this has been Pick. I'm glad to have seen you, and I hope to see you again. Visit my doc in the description.